Hey everyone, welcome back. Are you guys ready for another deep dive with me?
Always.
This one's going to be good. We're stepping back in time to the Roaring '20s. Think flapper dresses, jazz music.
And of course, gangsters.
Lots and lots of gangsters. And when you think of gangsters from that era, one name always comes to mind.
Al Capone?
Al Capone, a.k.a. Scarface. He's become almost like a legend.
Yeah, like the ultimate symbol of that whole era.
But I think his story's a lot more complex than just the gangster image. We're going to dig into all that today using this really cool podcast called Al Capone, Prohibition Era Crimes and the Rise of Organized Crime.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one. It's from the Crit Hour channel, right?
That's the one.
Yeah.
And what really fascinates me is how this guy went from a kid in Brooklyn to the most powerful gangster in America.
It's a wild story for sure.
Yeah.
And it all starts pretty humbly, actually. Most people don't realize Capone came from really humble beginnings.
Oh, wait.
Oh, yeah. He was one of 9 children.
9.
9 kids, born to Italian immigrant parents in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn.
Wow, 9 kids. I can't even imagine the chaos at dinner time.
Uh-huh.
But seriously, how much do you think his background played into him becoming a gangster? Like, was he almost destined for that life?
It's tough to say for sure, but growing up in poverty, facing prejudice as an immigrant, all that stuff definitely shapes you.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And he was a kind of rebellious kid, too. He actually dropped out of school at 14.
At 14?
Yeah, after hitting a teacher.
Oh, wow. Okay, so not exactly following the rules then.
Yeah.
So how did he go from, like, tough kid in Brooklyn to full-on gangster?
Well, street gangs were a big influence back then,
Mhm.
especially for someone like Capone. They offered a sense of community purpose, even power, things he wasn't finding elsewhere.
Makes sense. And this is where his mentors come in, right?
Right. 2 key figures really shaped young Capone,
Mm-hmm.
Johnny Torrio and Frankie Yale.
Ah, yes. The classic gangster mentors. I always love a good mentor story.
They were actually very different, though.
Yeah.
Like total opposites almost.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Torrio was more like the brains of the operation.
A real strategist.
He saw organized crime as a business, a way to build an empire. He was all about strategy alliances, keeping things low-key.
So not your typical gun-wielding tough guy.
Not at all. Frankie Yale, on the other hand, he was more of the traditional gangster.
Oh.
He ran a place called the Harvard Inn, where Capone worked as a bouncer. That's where Capone really learned the ropes of the underworld, built his reputation, and...
Got the nickname Scarface. We can't forget about that.
Of course not.
So what's the real story behind the scar?
Well, like a lot of things with Capone, the details are a bit murky, lots of myths and legends. The most popular story is that he insulted a woman at the Harvard Inn. Her brother got involved, things escalated, and Capone ended up with a slash across his face.
Ouch. Talk about a permanent reminder to be careful what you say.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got Capone, the tough kid from Brooklyn, learning from these 2 very different mentors. But he's still in New York. What was the big break that took him to the top?
Well, 1919 was a huge turning point. That's when Prohibition started with the Volstead Act. They outlawed the sale and manufacture of alcohol.
And that's what really gave rise to organized crime, right? Like the government basically handed them a golden opportunity.
You could say that Johnny Torrio, being the strategist that he was, saw the potential in Chicago. It was a booming city full of corruption and, of course, a huge demand for illegal booze.
So Chicago became like the Wild West of the 1920s.
Pretty much, Torrio invited Capone to join him there. It was a chance for Capone to put everything he learned to the test and really move up in the world.
And was Chicago as crazy as everyone says?
Oh, it was booming economically, but also riddled with corruption. Law enforcement was overwhelmed, often on the take. It was the perfect breeding ground for Torrio's big plans.
What kind of plans are we talking about here? Just a few speakeasies or something bigger?
Torrio wanted to control the entire illegal alcohol market in Chicago, and eventually even beyond. He built this whole network of illegal breweries, smuggling routes. He was basically the supplier for the entire country.
Wow, that's insane. He was like the CEO of illegal booze.
Pretty much.
Huh?
And to keep it all running smoothly, he even bribed officials to look the other way.
That's some serious power. And what was Capone's role in all this?
Well, first he was a muscle, the enforcer, making sure everyone knew who was boss. But Capone was smart. He was learning from Torrio, observing how to manage a huge operation, exploit the system. He was getting a masterclass in organized crime.
So he wasn't just a tough guy, he was learning the business side of things, too.
Exactly. And that would all come in handy when Capone eventually took over the entire operation.
Hold on, he took over the whole thing. How did that happen?
Well, in 1925, Torrio survived an assassination attempt. It shook him up pretty badly, and he decided to retire. He left the whole empire to Capone, who was only 26 at the time.
Wow, that's a lot of responsibility for a 26-year-old.
It was a huge gamble, but it paid off for Capone. He wasn't content with just maintaining what Torrio had built. He had his own vision for the Chicago outfit.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting. This is where Al Capone, the ruthless kingpin, really comes into his own.
Exactly. But I think we'll have to save that part of the story for part 2.
Yes. You'll have to come back for part 2 to hear how Capone consolidated his power and became the most notorious gangster in America.
It's a story you won't want to miss. So when Capone takes over, it's not exactly smooth sailing.
I can imagine. There were bound to be other gangsters who wanted a piece of the pie.
Oh yeah, Chicago in the late 20s was a total battleground. Different gangs fighting for control. The North Side gang, led by George Bugs Moran, was Capone's biggest rival.
So basically you've got these two powerful gangs clashing over territory and profits.
Exactly. And things got really violent, culminating in one of the most infamous events in gangster history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
That's the one that really cemented Capone's reputation as a ruthless killer, right?
It was brutal. On February 14th, 1929, 7 members of Moran's gang were gunned down in a garage.
I remember reading about this. The killers were dressed as cops, right?
Yeah. It was a planned execution. They lined the guys up against a wall and just opened fire with Tommy guns.
It's crazy how calculated it was.
And while Capone had an alibi, pretty much everyone believed he was behind it.
Yeah, that massacre really changed things. It showed how far Capone was willing to go. And it put a ton of pressure on law enforcement to finally bring him down.
They had to do something.
So how did they do it? How do you take down a guy like Al Capone? He seemed untouchable.
It's actually kind of surprising what brought him down.
Yeah.
It wasn't the violence or the murders.
What was it then?
Taxes!
Taxes! Seriously?
Oh, as crazy as it sounds, Capone's downfall was tax evasion.
That seems like a dumb mistake for someone so smart.
You'd think so, right? But Capone thought he was above the law. He had all these connections, bribes. He figured he could get away with anything.
But he didn't.
Nope. And this is where Elliot Ness and his team come in. The Untouchables.
Oh, yeah. The Untouchables, weren't they like this elite squad of agents who couldn't be bribed?
Exactly. They were determined to take down Capone, and they went after his bootlegging operations. Raids, seizures, shutting down breweries.
Hitting him where it hurt, his profits.
Exactly. But it was the IRS that really got him. They built this whole case against him for tax evasion, using financial records, witness testimonies.
So all that violence, and in the end, it was taxes that brought him down.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? But it shows that no one is above the law. Not even Al Capone.
So what happened? He gets convicted, right? What was the sentence?
11 years in federal prison.
11 years. Wow, that must have been a huge blow.
It was the end of an era. Capone's reign in Chicago was over.
Where did he serve his time?
He started out at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, but later he was transferred to Alcatraz.
Alcatraz. Talk about a notorious prison.
It was designed to hold the most dangerous criminals, a place of isolation, harsh conditions.
I bet that was tough for a guy like Capone.
It definitely took its toll. He'd contracted syphilis years earlier, and in prison his health deteriorated. He started showing signs of dementia.
So the mighty Al Capone ended up a broken man in Alcatraz.
It's a pretty dramatic fall from grace. Shows you how far someone can fall, no matter how powerful they seem.
What happened to Capone after he got out of prison?
He was released in 1939, but by then he was a shell of his former self. His health was ruined. His empire was gone.
Sad ending for a guy who was once on top of the world. What did he do with the rest of his life?
He lived quietly in Florida with his family. His syphilis had really done a number on him. He wasn't the same man anymore.
So the roaring 20s gangster ended up living a quiet life in Florida.
Life's full of twists and turns, right? But I think it shows how complex Capone's story really is.
It's been a fascinating journey exploring his rise and fall.
His story goes way beyond just being a gangster. It reflects a whole era in American history. The Prohibition era, the rise of organized crime.
He's definitely become a cultural icon, too. You see him everywhere in movies, books, TV shows.
He's larger than life.
Yeah.
But beyond the glamour and the notoriety, I think his story serves as a cautionary tale about the allure of power, the dangers of unchecked ambition.
It's amazing when you think about it, how much influence this one guy had. I mean, he went from a street thug to, like, a national figure.
Yeah, it's a crazy story, right? Almost too crazy to believe sometimes.
And it really makes you think about Prohibition, too.
Yeah.
This law that was supposed to be a good thing, but it ended up fueling organized crime.
Totally. It's the perfect example of unintended consequences.
Right.
You outlaw alcohol and what happens? You create a black market that guys like Capone can exploit.
Exactly. It shows you how complicated history is. It's not just about names and dates, it's about how everything's connected.
Oh, for sure. Capone's story isn't just about him. It's about the whole social and economic context of the time. The allure of power, the dangers of unchecked ambition.
And I think it speaks to our fascination with these larger-than-life figures,
Yeah.
even the ones who broke the law.
Yeah, there's something about Capone's story that just grabs you. It makes you think about morality ambition, the dark side of the American dream.
We've covered a lot of ground today in our deep dive into Al Capone's world. Thanks again to that Al Capone Prohibition-era crimes and the rise of organized crime episode from the Crit Hour.
It's a great podcast. Really makes you think.
It does. So in the end, Capone gets taken down not by bullets, but by the IRS. Kind of poetic in a way.
It shows that no one is above the law, no matter how powerful they seem.
And it reminds us that sometimes the most effective weapons aren't guns, but things like financial accountability.
Exactly.
Before we wrap things up, I gotta ask, could a figure like Al Capone rise to power in today's world?
That's a tough one. Would the same conditions that allowed him to thrive even exist today?
I mean, things are so different now. The technology, law enforcement.
True. But power and corruption are timeless, right?
That's true. So maybe the question isn't, could someone like Capone rise to power, but what form would that power take today?
Ooh, that's a good question to think about. Something for you listeners to ponder.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive. I hope you guys enjoyed learning about Al Capone.
It's a story that's both fascinating and disturbing. It reminds us that even in the face of immense wealth and power, justice can prevail.
And that the past isn't just a bunch of stories. It's a reflection of who we are and where we come from.
By understanding it, we can better navigate the present and shape the future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Al Capone. Until next time, keep exploring and keep asking questions.